All right, so I'm going to be doing another live today with Jacob Cooperman from Coop TV. And he's involved in some martial arts, some commentary for shows. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that and some of his background. So I'm going to bring him in here now.
What's going
What's
on,
going
man?
on?
Hold on, let me see. Let me see if I can hear you.
Sure.
Y'all good? Can I hear you?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Perfect. What's going on? Thanks for having me.
Good. So maybe for people that are just tuning into this, maybe you could kind of introduce yourself and, you know.
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, I do a ton of stuff. I don't even really know. That's the thing. It's like I don't know how to introduce myself right now. I guess like the most popular thing that I do at the moment, I do a little bit of YouTube, but I mostly do commentary for RFC Promotions, and then also I interview some of the fighters. And I think I'm going to be this January 13th at the Melrose Ballroom. I'm going to be doing the interviews. That's for what's the name of the K-Series event. So that's basically what I do is I just try to put out as much content as possible. I'm on the YouTube side of things, I'd say I do more so kind of motivational stuff or philosophical stuff. So it's really like right now I'm trying a little bit of everything, and it's kind of like a blessing and a cursing where it's like I feel like a lot of avenues I can go, but also it's nauseating choosing which one. To really long-winded answer to your question there.
Well, let's kind of talk about, how you got involved with promotion.
Well, yeah, no. So, I mean, I'd interviewed, shout out to Jesse. Maybe he'll see this, maybe he won't. But I'd given him an email. And at the time, I had thought this was right before I was going to graduate school. I went to Iona. And I always thought, I was like, I feel like I'd be really good at commentating or just talking about MMA because I'd watched it for so many years. I'd gotten into it way back when around the surge and the rise of like Ronda Rousey. And so it's like kind of, I mean, I wasn't normie in the mainstream adoption of MMA. So I said, listen, I want to start just emailing promotions. I went on Facebook Messenger, started just like sending stuff out, seeing who would bite. And I must have went through 25, 30 different promotions. And finally, Jesse was the only dude that was like, yeah, I mean, we need people. So let's give you a shot, see what happens. He went to Iona too. And I'm so glad, dude, because RFC, I don't know if have you ever watched any RFC stuff?
I haven't seen the promotion, no.
Well, we're up here. I know you're in Tulsa, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I have family up there. But we're pretty much, I'd say that they're the largest, probably premier MMA promotion up here in the Northeast, or over here in the Northeast, I should say. So it all worked out well in the end. I mean, I talked to Flex Fights. I talked to a bunch of other places, Bellator, and they're the ones that decided they wanted to give me a shot. I had my commentary debut at RFC 5, and it's just been uphill from there.
Now, how long ago was that when you had your debut?
Man, that must have been a couple months, 2-3 months now. Because when was I can't remember, because August was my first one, and then it might have been in 2-3 months now.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I actually had somebody else on before you a couple of days ago who kind of did the same thing, just kind of reached out to some promoters, didn't know any of them, eventually.
Well, dude, that's the thing that I always say is like, even what you did, I wanted to come on your show. I think you're referencing Tina came on the show, right?
Yeah.
Tina's a good friend of mine. I saw your stuff and I DM'd you. And I was like, hey, man, would love to come on the show. And you were graceful enough to lend your platform. And again, like, I really, really appreciate that. I feel like that's the way you can get most things. Like, the mass comm world is unbelievably small. And it takes you working in it for a while to be like, wow. Just also the world in general. Like, I was working, and I won't say exactly where I work, but I was working in this, I still do work in this podcast production place. And one day I'm engineering a show, and Mickey Gall, the UFC fighter, just comes walking in. He's like, hey, I need someone to engineer a show. Do you want to come in? Do you want to? I was like, okay. And then, he's such a good guy. He ended up taking us all out the day. So it was just like, it's weird how small everything is. And that's what I try to keep in mind is like, everyone's just an email away. Even the higher ups at CBS, one thing my mentor always says is, you find one email like, so the tag on an email, maybe it's like someone at Viacom.com. You could pretty much just take the entire staff list and email whoever you like. It's incredibly small.
Now, when you were doing it, did you feel like apprehensive, or it doesn't sound like, because you contacted so many promotions?
You mean apprehensive about just like kind of putting myself out
Yeah.
there, or?
Yeah.
No, man, listen, I think I'm kind of this belief, and this is something that I've been working on for a while, is that, you can't really, like, there's no real failure. So let's just say I reached out to someone and they said no, or, for instance, I got tons, like I can show you my Facebook messaging page. It's literally just like 50 different strikeouts. And then there's one RFC Promotions thing. So, listen, you could like strike out 50 times, but all you should take from those experiences is the one yes, or even the knowledge that you use to kind of take it in a different direction. So like each no or each ignore that I got, right? Because I could see when they would view it and then just not say anything, I would try to ask myself, like, how can I do something differently the next time? And so I would kind of, almost like sell myself in a way. And I got better and better at it. And then RFC was literally the last promotion that I emailed. It was the final iteration of how I tried to sell myself. And it finally worked. So that's why I always tell people, it's like, don't be apprehensive, just kind of get after it. And you'll end up where you need to be. Everyone, as long as you have that positive mindset and that's how you want to like shape your reality, that's what you can do.
How many people replied to you?
Literally, I think, well, out of all the promotions, I had only 2, and I must have hit up at least 75. And I think it was obviously RFC, excuse me, RFC, and then some random boxing promotion. I can't remember what promotion it was, but yeah, I mean, that's, and again, like, that's what I was trying to say. It's like, I'll only remember the RFC, because RFC has been such an experience being able to commentate for them, that I'm only going to remember RFC. I'm not going to, in the moment, all I could think about was, oh, damn, I'm getting, rejected, or I'm getting ignored by all these places. But now it's like, looking back, it's like, oh yeah, really all I remember is RFC saying yes, and how that made me feel when Jesse and I emailed, and Jesse was like, hey, yeah, no, we really, like, we take an interest in your stuff. We can't, I don't know if we can really necessarily work out, but come down to the gym, do stuff for us, and we'll see what happens. Like, that feeling of getting the job was very, very, I'll remember that forever, essentially.
So they kind of tested you out first. They brought you to the gym.
Yeah. So I ended up doing was for RFC 4, which took place at the Rockland GAA. The weigh-in, so they do weigh-ins on Fridays. And so for the weigh-in that Friday, Jesse had me come in, just interview some of the fighters. That's where I met a lot of the guys that are my people today. And just kind of like, I don't know if you I'm assuming watch a ton of MMA if you are an MMA platform. So like how they do sometimes with boxing, or even the UFC is starting to do it a little bit now. They'll do the face-offs or the gloves off where 2 guys sit at a table. It's kind of like that. I would grab everyone for a minute interview, just talk about their expectations for the fight. And it was fantastic. The only thing that went wrong, and this is typical me fashion, was the entire time I hadn't realized someone had unplugged the thing by kicking it with their foot. And so none of the audio was usable. So it was just one of those things. But they thought, they saw it in person. They saw how I interviewed the guys, and they thought it was good anyways. And they let me come down to the event the next day. And I taped everything. Like, I pretty much nailed everything down to the floor, all the cables, so it wouldn't happen again.
And when you, when you did these table interviews, they just kind of gave you feedback. They thought you did well enough. They'd just bring you down to do the show then. Well,
yeah. So like the entire gym wasn't really that large. It was kind of just like, I don't even know how to describe it. I mean, I'm assuming you've been in a couple of martial arts gyms. Like, it's like kind of smaller than a normal sized gym that maybe they have equipment in a different room. This one was just bags and mats and things of the like. So, I mean, everyone was within earshot of me and eye shot. And it was funny too. Some of the fighters were like, who the hell is this guy? What is he doing? Because, it's like they hadn't really had anyone that was kind of considered like media before. And so I even had certain fighters coming over to me, but Jesse was right over there. He heard my stuff. And the next day I got back to him. I said, yeah, the audio is unusable. If you don't want to use me, I get it. That was a big mistake. And he said, no, man, it was more so just to see what you could do. And yeah, I got the job.
So is this promotion in New York?
Yeah. It's right near me. I'm up in Westchester, so they're like a 45-minute. Usually, most of their events are 45 minutes. One of them was in Newburgh, and one of them, like I said, was at the Rockland GAA, and then this next one, which they're partnering, it's going to be a big partnership. And if anyone's listening to this in post, and you guys wanna, I'll shout out to Ethan. Ethan was on the first event that I had actually done interviews for, and he's a great guy. I got the chance to interview him, but the next one they're going to be at, I think, the Melrose Ballroom, and tickets are definitely on sale for that. It's going to be a crossover promotion, so they do stuff all over the place, but it's mainly in New York. Yeah.
So this guy Jesse, maybe mention his last name. So he's the promoter.
Yeah. Yes, Jesse Brown. Well, so he does. It's actually Ricky is the main promoter, and he was a former pro kickboxer himself. Jesse handles all of the way he described it to me is kind of excuse me, is he handles all the logistics. So he's a finance guy. He knows, how to set everything up at the venues, get everyone's MMA licenses cleared, everyone's kickboxing licenses cleared, and then he goes through and he's kind of the glue, and it makes sense. He's a very good guy. He's the glue that keeps all of these events together.
Mm-hmm. So he kind of books venues and whatnot.
Yeah. Or just even if like a fighter falls out, he'll, have to let the promoters know, and then the guys that match it up, and then he does damage control. That's not all he does, but without Jesse, he's kind of like the quarterback of the whole operation. So he's like so important to everything kind of coming together the way it does.
How close are you to Buffalo?
Dude, not close at all. I'm like maybe probably a 5-hour drive, maybe like 3-4, something like that.
I know a guy there, Christian Printup. He works at a casino out there. Trying to remember the name of it, but he did a lot of that kind of stuff for Bellator when Bjorn Rebney was in charge of it. He would book a lot of the casinos and whatnot.
It is weird too. I was thinking about this the other day. Like promotions like Bellator that are a little bit more small. PFL is starting to get, because they're kind of coupling up with ESPNs. Now they're a little bit bigger, and they do shows now at the Hulu Theater at MSG. But it is weird to where I've talked to certain people around, and they're like, and I always used to think of Bellator as this like faraway promotion, and they're like, no, I've been on and around these events, and like, yeah, these events happen mostly at casinos where certain other smaller events happen, and sometimes they'll just call up amateur fighters to these events at Bellator if one of the pros drops out. So Bellator, I didn't even realize this, but Bellator is kind of like the go-between between amateur and pro promotions. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't know how long you followed Bellator, but I mean, Bjorn Rebney originally started it.
Oh.
And he started it as kind of like on ESPN Deportes, like Spanish, or MTV, I'm sorry.
It was originally on MTV?
Yeah, on MTV, and then he went to ESPN Deportes. And he had like a tournament format, season and tournament, kind of like PFL.
Yeah.
Does. But Bellator decided to go in a different direction with Scott Coker, and more like a matchmaking event. But Christian, he works at, I think it's called Seneca Casino, and it's in Buffalo, and he books all the entertainment venues there, all the acts that come through. So, yeah, maybe you should contact him.
I mean, yeah, I'm always looking, but like, again, like RFC, all the guys, even Ethan, I don't know if Ethan's still in here, but dude, all the fighters have just accepted me like they're my family, and that's the greatest thing. I'll get excuse me, DMs from guys that have fought, and it's like we had one guy, Isaiah Torres, that I had on my show, and he locked up this insane guillotine choke, and I had the pleasure of calling his fight in something like 42 seconds, and he was the one that was like, hey man, why didn't you interview me? I wanted to get an interview. And I was like, dude, yeah. He's like, I think it's so sick what you do. I think it's so cool. I was like, I think your thing, like choking another man unconscious in 42 seconds, is a little bit cooler than me just talking about it on mic, but we'll have to get you. So, no, they've shown so much respect, man. And I think it is partially because a lot of these amateur promotions, they don't really have, unfortunately, or even the amateur fighters, they don't have anyone like kind of telling their stories. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's because that a lot of people don't really notice that there are so many marketable personalities. Like Ethan, when I interviewed him, it was the home crowd from Ireland was electric. I mean, he had like a crazy reaction to his fight. His fight was a banger, and he had this insane. And maybe Ethan, if you're still here, type it down. I can't remember what you said, but it was like something to the tune of like, I'm Irish. We don't get knocked out. And it was like, dude, I could see that being in like some insane UFC post fight, but no one would ever think to kind of cover these guys just because they're amateur. And so in that weird way, I kind of like stumbled into a market that needed to be filled.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people, there might be people that see this that might ask you to put them, because there's a lot of guys out there, like you're saying, that they don't get any exposure because they're not in the UFC or Bellator or whatever. And, fighters, some of them need exposure, want exposure, or to, try to help with different things. And that's kind of, I looked at some of your stuff. You've been doing some stuff like this already, but it's pretty endless what you can do,
Dude, and we were talking about this when I DM'd you asking to come on the show. Is like, you were like, I just like giving out my platform. You're doing the same thing that I'm doing. You're creating stories for people. That's a big, what I've learned, cornerstone of media is just creating narratives, creating stories. That's the backbone of literally every single, going back as far as caveman times, right? Like stories have been the thing that have driven society. And so if you can create those and you can create like value for people listening and watching, then that's all you can really, and dude, to your point, like you've created something here and it's noticeable. That's why I wanted to come on the show, where it's like, yeah, you give people a platform. That's of value. You have these interesting conversations. You're a great interviewer. You're able to keep it going. I've been on shows. I'm not going to say which shows because they've never aired, where it's like, I feel like I have to do all the heavy lifting. So you do a great job as well, and it should be universal. I feel like that people do this, where it's like you create that story around whoever you have on your program.
I appreciate that. Let's talk a little bit about, because I know you mentioned, okay, I hit up these promotions. Let's talk about what was your background before that made you feel like, okay, this is something I can do.
Well, it's funny. I've done a ton of stuff just on, like I said, like YouTube, podcasting, live streaming. I had covered some. I had gone down to like the Yankees AAA team and interviewed some of the players. That was always really fun. I just always enjoyed listening to podcasts. That's where it all started off for me. Whenever I'd feel particularly stressed in middle school, high school, just pop in a podcast. I could feel like I was part of a conversation. And after a while, I talked and talked and talked about it. This went way back to like sophomore year of high school. I talked and talked and talked about it. And finally, I was sitting there and I was like, you know what? My friend said, you got a voice for it. Just try it. If you don't like it, then you have a throwaway piece of audio that you can keep locked up in a safe and it'll never have to see the light of day. And if you like it, you keep going. And then since then, I've just created, I don't know how many IPs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2 of which are still semi-alive. The Jacob Cooperman show and then Spreading the Floor. I kind of tend to a little bit. And as for the MMA commentary stuff, like I said, I'd always watched it. I'd had, not like falling out with my podcast co-host, but he had gone on to do other things. And naturally, I kind of just wanted to go off, do my own thing. And I saw a little avenue there. And I said, wouldn't it be great if I tried to do MMA commentary, see how it turned out? And I guess the rest is history.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, when did you find the sport, you think?
When I started watching it, that was I was never a Conor hype boy. That's the other. I can't stand Conor hype boys that'll rewatch his fight. But I kind of got into it because of Conor, if that makes any sense. The stuff that he was doing, he brought widespread attention to the sport. Same with Ronda Rousey. I got into MMA then. I stuck to guys like Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. He's one of my favorite fighters. Robert Whitaker. And I'd say right in the midst of the Reebok deal. Before they had the colored shorts, but they had the black and white ones. Right around that time period, I watched, I think my first pay-per-view event I paid for was when Conor McGregor absolutely annihilated Eddie Alvarez at MSG. That's single-handedly, I think, the best striking performance I've ever seen from an athlete. But yeah, it was around that time that I kind of got into the sport, and ever since then, boxing, whatever it is, even like ADCC, I like to watch a little bit of jiu-jitsu. I've just been into that stuff.
Yeah, it's come a long way, but the community is still small, like you're saying. guys were always accessible, even from the beginning. Like I followed the sport since UFC two. And the community always had a small feel. I mean, obviously, because at the beginning the sport wasn't very, but I say even now, guys are pretty accessible. I mean, I don't really have a lot of UFC fighters on my show because a lot of people interview them. So
Right.
it's like, why should I do it? But people are pretty accessible, and so like you're saying, I think if it's something you want to do as far as content creation goes, there's a lot of people doing this stuff, but, you know.
Well, no, 100%. And it's also, to your point, it is a weirdly small community, especially because it's like you see other sports, right? And maybe hockey's kind of in that space where it's like it's on ESPN, but it's also niche. It's a weird feeling with MMA where I can't just go and talk to anyone about the best MMA athletes or like, did you watch the card last night? But it's also on ESPN and they show it sometimes on like ESPN News. It's a weird thing where it does feel overhyped. Maybe just the UFC, I'm sure you'd be like hard pressed to find people that watched the PFL card last night. Sometimes I don't even catch the PFL cards or like the Bellator cards. But yeah, it is. I'd say when you get into the really like hardcore community, guys, like I like to watch Glory Kickboxing. I know we both like to watch ADCC. Like those guys are definitely far and few between. The guys that really know the sport. And then you get the guys that, again, like the Connor fanboys or, it's like that have no idea what they're watching. And those people are so funny to listen. If you ever watch with a casual fan and they're like, why doesn't he just get up? Get his hands off you. It's like, oh my goodness.
Yeah, I mean, at the early events, it was like that a lot. Going to different events. Like when I lived in Oahu, a lot were like that. When I lived in Japan, it was totally different. The crowd was very educated, even a long time ago.
Really?
So they,
was that at the K1 era?
yeah, I lived in Japan from 2002 to 2005, and yeah, they don't really talk much during the fight. They'll react if something happens, but the rest of the time they're pretty quiet for the most part. So they were already educated, long ago on what was going on. Because a lot of those guys have been training and like putting everything together since the early '90s. So the fans were already educated, and judo was, for a lot of them, part of their school curriculum. So they had a lot of education in martial arts just from their normal lives.
Yeah, and also a lot of education and respect too. Like a lot of, I feel like Western society is that thing where it's like you meet a guy in a bar and he's like, well, I just see red when I black out. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, buddy. But a lot of people, when someone is kind of well trained in respect, I feel like, much more quiet, is much more, and just in any discipline, not even fighting, it's kind of something you could tell. They're not going to pass judgment. For me, someone that is really well trained in respect or is really well versed in like the art of learning is someone that's not going to talk a lot. I could immediately tell when someone is, and I don't mean talking the way we're talking now, but I don't know, usually like the loudest guy in the room is probably the least intelligent or the least secure, in my personal opinion, if that makes any sense.
And even Abu Dhabi, like in the early years of Abu Dhabi, there was no spectators. Take Tanoon, who owns part of the UFC now, he was the one who formulated that tournament. And you had to be invited, and he was the only guy there that was watching for the most part. That was him and his buddies, and nobody else was there. So it was almost like blood sport, You didn't know anyone that was there. You kind of had to hear through the internet, like if some of the fighters put out what happened, or you had some different reporters that were there, guys like Rafael Torre and Kid Pellegro. They were some of these early journalists that were at Abu Dhabi. So you wouldn't be able to hear what happened until they put it out. It was like a super secret thing, so to speak. But
that had to be
had an aura because of that.
That's what I promise I'm not cool. But that's something that I've always wondered about, like being on the cutting edge of something like that. Or even, let's just say, like I like to use Ariel Helwani. I know he's pretty obviously widespread now, and a lot of people know who he is. But when he was covering the earlier UFC stuff before it had kind of, and maybe it hasn't even breached the mainstream yet, but it's certainly a lot more mainstream than it was back then. He was kind of in that position where, to him, it's got to be an awkward feeling because to him, he's probably like, okay, he's super duper passionate about the sport. This is what I live and breathe, UFC and MMA. And then he'll report on something. And to your point, it'll be like, oh, yeah, like a small community of people are going to react to this.
Mm-hmm.
And then to see as you build up your career, the sport build with you, like that's something that I feel like a lot of guys don't get nowadays, where you'll have like a new journalist cover baseball or NHL or the NFL, like they're going into something that's already established. It's a gigantic machine. Everyone's pushing the media there, and then you have this guy that's coming in. But when you get to grow together, that's got to be an interesting feeling.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of who was around the beginning that's still here in that area. There's this guy, Josh Gross. He's still around. He does some stuff for like the Atlantic. And he was one of the early guys to cover the sport, like in the 90s. So, but Ariel, I think, came along maybe 2008, 2007. So it wasn't at the beginning. But trying to think of who else might still be around. There were a lot of people that were covering it back then that aren't really involved in the sport much now. I don't know if you ever go on the underground. That's where we all were in the 90s. That's kind of like our social media. It's called MMA.tv if you go there. And they have a forum there called Underground. It used to be called submissionfighting.com, and you had to have a screen name and a password to get in. You couldn't read the website,
Top secret.
You had to log in first. Yeah. So that's where we all were, in the 90s, all the hardcore guys, and then a lot of the fighters that were just starting to come up were there too. Guys like guys that were in the UFC already, or in the early 90s.
So I want to turn this around. I have a question for you. How does it feel for you being one of the fans that was there ground floor
Mm-hmm.
and then having it now blow up to the point where it has? Like, do you feel like a sense of like pride there, or is it like kind of like yeah, these people, they're around now while the flashy lights are there and they're on ESPN, but I was there from the jump. You know what I'm trying to say?
I had done some of this kind of stuff before. I had done some interviews in the 90s. But for me, it was like, dang, I probably could have done more stuff, had I decided to, So but I felt like that was kind of a missed opportunity, so to speak. But, yeah, I think it's cool where it's at now. I mean, I don't have no problem with it. I still watch it a lot. A lot of my friends don't watch it as much, people that were really big into it before. But
why do you think that is? Do you think they just kind of like grew out of it, or do you think the sport outgrew them?
The people I found that have grown out of it were the people that were involved in it. Like that Christian who is up at Seneca. I mean, they're having some MMA events at his casino, but people that were in the sport working in it, they don't follow it as heavily as maybe people that weren't, or people like me even. But some of my friends that were fighters already, like in the 90s, they don't follow as much because they're not competing, so they don't feel the connection to it. But,
I was gonna say, it's kind of that thing. Like for one summer I worked at Starbucks, and I would make coffees all day. I get free coffee, like everything that I wanted in the store, and I kind of like overdosed on coffee. And then for a couple months after that, no coffee whatsoever. And so I'm sure it is that thing where it's like I'll cover a card on like a Saturday, for RFC, and I'll even use my commentary debut. I commentated. It was like 20 fights, 20 bouts that night. And then I think there was also, that might have been the night of the Jake Paul Anderson Silva fight. And if I had gotten back to the house, I probably would have had time to watch it. I was just like, I've seen enough fighting in one night. I'm good for like the rest of the week. You know what I mean? So I'm sure it is that thing where you kind of get burnt out on something if you do it enough. Even with the on-air stuff that I do. If I record a ton of stuff in a week, like a podcast, a video, an interview, like you need time. You need time away from that stuff to kind of like separate and make sure you recharge your batteries. That's a key balance that I didn't even understand for a while. I just worked myself for like 2-3 years, and it was all based on my insecurity. I just worked myself to the bone, and then I learned that lesson that you need to be apart from things sometimes. So I call it like separating and elevating. You need to be a part of things sometimes, or apart from things sometimes, to make sure that you can grow outside of it and you come back to it with a little bit more of an appreciation.
Yeah, for me, this is stuff is just fun, so it's not. I can do it anytime. It's not anything that I have to step away from. You know, it's easy. I could do them every day if I needed to. You know, or if I had to schedule every day, I could do it, no problem. But yeah, I mean, it's something you got to really want to do. Because, like I said, I had friends who would talk about this stuff for a long time, and I don't know if Daryl Palmer's still in here. He was already fighting in the '90s. You know, he was fighting these basically no holds barred. You know, an open weight, no time limit. You know,
Oh my God!
On a Wahoo. You know, some of the early fights there. So, like I was saying, there are guys like that around that are still attention. And I think with social media, some of these guys who probably wouldn't have been maybe answering questions about it get asked more questions. So they kind of have to pay attention to what's going on because they're on social media and people still ask them questions about this stuff. So they're being nice and they feel obligated to answer. So they have to pay attention or still follow what's going on. You know, especially if they're teaching at a gym, things like that.
Yeah.
They still have to stay kind of up to date to what's going on. But, like, for example, I had interviewed Dean Thomas, who does TV stuff for the UFC.
Oh, he's great. He's dope.
1997, 98. I've known him that long. So some of these guys that have been around for a long time, I've known for many years. So the community's always been that way to a certain degree. There are guys that you probably could, just like this thing Ariel Helwani have with Paddy the Batty.
Interesting situation.
Yeah, there's some guys who probably maybe they aren't as accessible, and that's for whatever decision they decided to do that. Whether it's his manager, him, he might say, well, it's not what is it worth it to me? I don't need the exposure, If I go on your show, you're getting more out of it than me. I don't need to do it. So you can pay me or I won't do it, Maybe that's the way he sees it. Or Conor McGregor, same thing. If he goes on someone's show, is he really getting, what is he getting out of it? He already has a yacht and millions of dollars. He probably doesn't need to do
that is for me.
Okay, I got you. Yeah. I was going to actually ask your opinion on this.
situation.
What's up?
What did you think of that situation?
I was going to ask you the same thing. I was going to say, what did you, as a guy that's done journalism before, I do think to ask a guy to pay, and I understand that it was kind of like they asked BT Sport to create a budget for him to come on, so it wasn't exactly asking Ariel for money. And in that sense, I do kind of think that Ariel maybe overreacted a little bit and got into his feelings. And I can understand where Paddy's coming from with that, where it's like, oh, yeah, Ariel kind of just exploded out of nowhere. But I also see it from Ariel's side where, journalism, you shouldn't, like the journalist doesn't have to pay to get people on. I mean, I'm sure it's happened before, but, Ariel brought up a great point. Like Joe Rogan doesn't pay for his guests. All these people, like Jimmy Kimmel doesn't pay for his guests. If that's kind of, to make someone in that position pay to get you on their show, I think kind of goes against like the MMA or in anything, the journalism ecosystem that we have going on. Because it is like a symbiotic, and I was talking to Jesse about this for RFC. I feel like it's a symbiotic relationship where everyone's getting a nice, hefty little bit of exposure off of this. You have Paddy on your show, you get Paddy's fan base. But Paddy is also introduced to Ariel's fan base. And out of that, there's that third byproduct of I guess you'd say tri-product of journalism, like MMA journalism. Maybe Paddy says something on air that's like breaking news, So, yeah, I see it from both perspectives. I don't like how Paddy kind of tried to twist the truth and came out and called him a scumbag after all the messages. But there's a little bit more duality to the situation. I think a lot of people are giving it credit for.
I thought he said he was going to reply after the event. He hasn't yet, so I'm a little disappointed. I'm waiting.
Paddy said was going to
Yeah, I
respond.
want to see more drama because
Oh,
yeah,
my
he said
goodness.
to do another video about this stuff. But for me, I think Ariel isn't being entirely honest because, like he's saying, I don't get any money if so and so's on or this person's on. Part of his contract, he said, I have a contract. Yeah, you have a contract because you have access to certain people. If you're just interviewing me every day, they probably wouldn't pay you as much, you know. But because you can interview Paddy Pimblett, your contract, at least to MMA Hour, is viable. For example, ESPN, they probably didn't give him an offer that he wanted to stay there for. Why? Because Dana White had blocked him from attending the UFC, getting any kind of at the event coverage. So ESPN was probably like, yeah, you're a good reporter and all, but if you can't cover our flagship MMA event, if you can't go there and interview Dana White and the fighters, what we need to pay you for? We'll just get somebody else in here who can do that. And that's what they did. So his access does dictate what his contract is. So for him to say, I don't get paid more whether this person comes on or that, it's not true. He does paid by the show. Yeah, he's getting a salary, but his salary is dictated. Nobody, he wouldn't have a show to talk on. He'd be like us, talking on here.
Talking on Instagram Live.
Have to create a show. Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
That's a very good point. I didn't even think about it like that. That is a very good point. And I think, sure, Ariel does have his own personality. And do I think he could host a show without, maybe if that's kind of excuse me, if that's the defense he wanted to use, rather than, hey, I don't, make anything off of you guys, to say, hey, I could do my own show without interviewing so many fighters. That might be true. Like, me personally, I'd tune in if people were just asking questions and he was reacting to some of the biggest news of the week, right? And one of the big discrepancies in the whole thing that went down was that Paddy was calling Ariel this content creator, and Ariel saying, no, I'm a journalist. But he is kind of a mixture of both, if you think about it. He does create content that's aside from being journalistic, right? Like, let's not sit here and pretend like Ariel doesn't, in some level, enjoy these these back and forths, especially the one he had with Brendan Schaub. Like, he sat there and he talked in both of these situations. He made like hour-long videos talking about it, and so for him to also sit there and be like, "Well, I'm a journalist. I have a lot more integrity." It's like, all right, well, a real journalist probably wouldn't be. I mean, don't they tell you the first thing they teach you in mass comm journalism school is, hey, don't be the story. You report on the story, but you're not supposed to be the story. So I agree. I think there's a lot more of a gray area. I know a lot of people viewed it as like a 10-8 round for Ariel, but I don't know. I kind of, maybe like a 10-9 or a split draw. I'm not sure.
No, you make a good point. When you're constantly in different kind of battles with various people, whether it be Dana White, Brendan Schaub, Paddy, whoever else, you have some culpability in that, whether you want to admit it or not. If you're constantly at odds with people, in your community, you're contributing to that, and he doesn't, I don't know if he does that on purpose where he doesn't want to take responsibility kind of as an act, that's part of his gimmick. But yeah, he never takes responsibility for his role when things going south.
Well, yeah, and part of me does think that he is a little bit, at least, like, somewhat cognizant of it, because he does. I think he's the one that coined the phrase Helwani.
Yeah, exactly.
So like he knows what he's doing a little bit. He's like, I'm not gonna just let these people walk all over me, because now I have my own platform and all this stuff. So I think he knows what he's doing for sure. And I wouldn't even have a problem necessarily. And I'm not sure I have the biggest problem, because I don't really have a horse in that race. I'm not really the biggest fan of Paddy, and I'm not like the biggest fan of Ariel. It's not that I don't like them. I just don't really particularly care about either of them. It was just interesting to kind of view it from that Ariel perspective and then the Paddy perspective as well. I think if Ariel had come out, like if I was in the shoes, I probably would have responded and said, listen, you asked to make a pack, for BT Sport to set up some sort of a budget. I didn't want to do it. And yeah, sure, I overreacted a little bit, but now you're coming out and you're calling me a rat, a rodent, all these different things with a guy that hates me. And that's where I do believe that Paddy is wrong. And yeah, listen, like I overreacted. To your point about me getting exposure or getting paid off of fighters coming on, to your point, you said it best, is like, yeah, I have that contract because I can talk to you guys. I'm a part of the community because I can talk to you guys. It's a two-way road. And, listen, like, it is what it is. And I do like talking about this stuff. It does bring me. So I would have just been very kind of open and honest and transparent with it. I think it's something rubbed me the wrong way about the way he sort of like always puts himself on the defensive and says, oh, yeah, I'm being attacked by everyone else. I mean, like, just in the same way that he plays that journalistic role, like the fact that he is under fire from Dana White, from Paddy, from Brandon Schaub, like that's entertainment in the MMA community,
Sadly, but yeah.
Yeah. And there's a whole other conversation you could have about like whether or not that's healthy for the MMA community, whether or not that brings more eyes, and like kind of weighing the pros and cons of that. That's a super interesting conversation you could have. But I think at the base level, the two guys, and even Paddy could serve to be a little bit more transparent, should just be taking a little bit more responsibility on either side, I feel like.
Yeah, like I said something to him on Twitter about, like you say, they tell these same lies over and over again, people believe it. And I said, no, they believe it because you're constantly in the situation.
Yeah, right? Yeah, like you're constantly going at odds with other fans, but what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, I'm like, of course they're going to believe it. You're constantly battling with people. You're doing it for them.
Yeah, and a business too that, like, you think about some of the biggest selling UFC pay-per-views, it's all been in insane rivalries. Most of them actually coinciding with Conor McGregor, but it's like you're in that business.
But like the thing that he always likes to cry about is this Brock Lesnar thing, right? Like he's saying, well, I was just breaking news. He's right, but there are a lot of people that put in a lot of work to put that promo together, to keep that thing a secret. The people who do like these embedded shows and so on and so forth, they put a lot of time and effort into that stuff. And then for you to go out there and just blurt it out, it sucks for them. They put all this time and effort because they were going to have this promo come on during the event, which they did. They still did it. But, that's what they were telling them, like, don't break this. We have some big promo. We want to drop it during the event. It'll surprise everybody, and he just went out there. So, in my opinion, it's different than, like, had it been during the week, I probably wouldn't have had a big deal with it. If he had done it, like, several days before, it still would have sucked for them. But to do it at the event, he didn't really need to do it. The event was already taking place. They were going to find out in, another 30 minutes, an hour, or whatever it might have been. But he wanted to do it, and that part to me, it's like it wasn't your secret to tell. These people put the work in to do this thing. Had you dropped it on a Monday and the event was Saturday, that's different. But to drop it while you're at the event, while you're sitting there, the fans are going to find out in an hour anyway. But you wanted to get the credit for, I'm Ariel, like you said, make yourself the story. I want to be the one who breaks this news, not the UFC. And that's what started down this path to begin with, this bad path. And so, and he always kind of like tries to say, oh, I wasn't doing anything. Of course you were. Yeah, you were.
And dude, that's the thing. It's like, to your point, and I think you surmised it perfectly, is I wouldn't have a problem, and I'll take it a step further from what you said, right? If Helwani said, listen, yeah, I had the story, I wanted to break it. Simple as that. That's what journalism is. There wasn't it may be a little bit looked more favorably upon by the public if they'd been trying to stifle or stifle that information for a while, or it was some kind of wrongdoing on the side of the UFC. Because the way I think that Helwani tried to spin it was that it's like, oh yeah, I'm just doing investigative journalism. It's not investigative journalism if you spoil what's supposed to be, to your point, a thing that guys have worked so hard. It's not this insidious thing, right? Like a corporation is not dumping oil into the ocean. You're not some hero coming in there on a helicopter and like getting a B-roll shot of everything going on. You're just ruining a surprise. So if he had come out, and I doubt he'll ever do this because I think his image now, he believes, is built up to be too good. But if he had come out and said, yeah, I broke the story because I wanted to, and you know what? I'm going full Helwani mode. I think he would actually really, really benefit from that. Like if he went completely just opposite way, where it's like this journalist that used to work for the UFC, then got disgraced by Dana White, shut out, and now is like his biggest nemesis. I honestly think that would really play into his favor. And if he just went rogue mode, and maybe even, and this might be sanctimonious, but he's already kind of tread this line or even crossed it. If he just wanted to start going like full content creator mode and making hit pieces on the UFC, that could be a really, really big part of the culture. Because you think about all the guys, and I don't know about your perspective, your take on guys like Brett Okamoto or any of the talking heads that the UFC has in. They don't really, I think it's fair to say, they don't really challenge anyone there. You know, it's kind of like softball questions down the middle. And hey, there should be someone kind of like Helwani. And he's, again, playing that role a little bit here and there that does look at things and be like, yeah, that's actually really terrible. Like, why? What's up with that Paddy stoppage? You know, like, not stoppage, but the decision. You know, why did Jared Gordon get robbed there? My personal opinion, he got robbed. You know, and I'll look at even the post-fight press conference after the fact, and everyone's asking like, yeah, you know, Dana, everyone's a little bit pissed off because of the Flash Gordon, robbery, and everyone, you know, can you speak to that? Did you think it's like you should be asking why did the judges see this as a even semi-close fight when Paddy allowed Jared Gordon to control him up against the fence in the clinch the entirety of the third round? And arguably, you know, you could go back and talk about rounds 1 and 2, but, you know, why is this the case? We want answers. Nobody really challenges them like that. So if Ariel wants to step up and be that guy that kind of plays antithesis to the UFC, I wouldn't mind that.
Yeah, but what? It's not the judges, man. Everyone's looking at the judges. I said this already on my stuff. They just did what the UFC wanted. The UFC wanted Paddy to win, so he won. It ain't nothing. That's why they will never get fixed. They needed him to win. The judges made sure he won. It is not the judges. It's the UFC. Same with Sean O'Malley. The UFC needed Sean O'Malley to win that fight, so he won. It's not the judges. It's the UFC. They're the ones controlling this stuff. Not the judges.
I could see that. I could see that. But I'm also I'm a cautious optimist. So I always hope that, you know, maybe there was just like a pro Paddy crowd. You know what I mean? And maybe that's what swayed. But if that's true, and the UFC was like, hey, we kind of need this guy to win, you know, that's just despicable.
For sure. I mean, he was standing with their sponsor, Barstool. You saw Dana White standing with them while the decision's being read. You know, and when your promotion's under investigation for, you know, some gambling stuff and whatnot, that's just a bad look. I don't know what he was thinking. Oh, it'll be a good idea for me to stay on with Paddy's sponsor while the decision's being, you know, my promotion's already under question for some shady gambling stuff. I mean, it's like, come on, man. You know, where's your head at? Stay cage side. Just sit in your chair. You know, it's like, come on, dude.
That's a very good point.
They needed him to win, and that's why he won. And that's why the judges won't be challenged. In fact, the judges are the perfect fall guys for them. Yeah, blame them. It's their fault. They're inept. No, don't look at us. They're the ones that are inept.
In fact, Dana actually said that. He said, look at, you know, it's nothing that we did, but you got to look at the whoever it is at the time, the NYASC, because I know usually the New York Athletic Commission, they've had some pretty abhorrent calls. Dana likes to use them, or just even like you look at Sal D'Amato, who for my money is also a terrible referee in boxing or in MMA. But like, yeah, you're right. That could be an easy, just kind of like, hey, look over here and redirect, and we're over here. You know, that's a very good point.
And I mean, what was the guy's name? The guy one of the guys that gave all 3 rounds to Paddy. Jeez, forgot his name.
Oh,
but then
God.
Gave all 5 rounds to Sabatello in the fight that Sabatello lost to Stock.
It just makes you wonder. It's like some of these. It's like you almost have to be a conspiracy theorist.
They brought him to their event to judge their event.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah.
And he's been judging events for a long time. Doug Crosby's his name, and yeah, he's put in a lot of bad decisions over the years. But you know, it's easier for them to just let the judges take the brunt of it. The judges did what they wanted them to do. It's not a big deal for them. You know, they got what they wanted out of it. And
Well, let me ask you this, and I do have to, unfortunately, I don't mean to cut this conversation, but I do have to go here in a second. I want to get your opinion, though. I'm going to throw you this question. Where do you think that Paddy will end up? Because I know a lot of people talk about like his hype train. I personally think it's non-sustainable, or maybe it is sustainable. If they keep him the way they're going and he keeps fighting tomato cans, I think a lot of people are also putting like championship expectations, because that's what a lot of people think about in the sport, right? Is like the main goal is to get a championship, and that's what Paddy himself has said. But I can't see him getting past the level where he's at now, especially in the way he looked in that Flash Gordon fight. I mean, like Gordon used the same. It was like a body hook or a right body hook to a left hook up top, and Paddy just hands down. And listen, I don't fight, so any fighter Paddy could kick my ass, but hands down the entire time, and was just eating hooks repeatedly. So to that, it's like he's clearly not, in my personal opinion, championship caliber. Like, where do you see him going?
I talked about this with the guy a couple shows back. You might want to watch it, but who do you put him in with? We were asking
Who?
other that, and it was like a long pause. Like, man, I don't know. Like, who could you put him in with where you could say, yeah, he'll win that fight? I don't know.
Anyone that goes through a decision.
Who do you match him up against? Where you could say, yes, he'll win that fight.
And you're totally confident. I don't know.
I don't know who it is.
Like he gets eviscerated by anyone easily, I think, in the top 15. Anyone with decent hand speed, anyone with decent striking. Maybe he gives guys problems on the ground. I mean, that's where his most strong skill set lies.
Give me a name. Like, we couldn't come up with a name. We were trying to think of a name. Like, who could he fight next? And
who would it
make
sense for him to fight next? Maybe like a fun fight would be, I don't know, like I know Bobby Green just got knocked out by Drew Dober. That was a fun fight. But Bobby Green, I feel like, smokes him. Bobby Green, and I don't even think you get him out of there by knockout, Bobby Green. But Bobby Green would just evade, and maybe that would actually be a fun fight. I don't know. But again, like Bobby Green's not a guy, I don't know. I know he goes for a lot of decisions typically. So can you really trust the judges if he goes through a decision? So it's just too many non-factors, to your point, to really say it's like, who do you match this guy up with where it's not going to be marred by controversy or he's not going to get smoked? I know he doesn't want any part of Ilia Topuria, because Ilia Topuria absolutely, it looked like one of those Nat Geographic videos of like a tiger or like a lion mauling one of its prey. Like, that was what he did to Bryce Mitchell was nothing short of terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know who you put him in with, because 155 is a real tough division, even for guys that aren't ranked. There's a lot of great fighters in that division, and it's like we were trying to think of a name, and we couldn't think of. Maybe you could bring Tony Ferguson back to fight him.
Yeah, it would only have to be like really, really. I struggle to say, like, I guess over the hill would be, but I really don't know. And maybe I always like to view things from an optimistic standpoint. So maybe that's almost like you have a wealth of guys that you could put him up against. You're not sure who, and then that kind of is part of the spectacle. But I mean, in reality, I don't know. I don't know where you're going to take it from here. But if there's any organization that I'm sure could match him up or make it work or make something that's kind of fun for the fans, it's probably the UFC. I say a lot of complimentary stuff and say a lot of bad stuff, but one of the things that the UFC is really, really good at is creating really compelling fight cards. Sometimes they flop, but most times I feel like, for the most part, even the stuff they give us on fight nights, whoever they got matchmaking, and I think it might be like Hunter Campbell, a mixture of him, Dana White, all those guys, they always, I feel like, do a good job, at least on paper, of creating good fights.
Sean Shelby and Nick Maynard do the matchmaking. Now, Sean Shelby is one of those guys that was around on the underground. He was one of those guys that was around back then. He had his own website. It's called MMA Ring Report. And, it was him, and he had this guy from Japan. They had their own little forum. And, yeah, so Sean Shelby was on there. So he was one of those hardcores who got a job with the UFC. Joe Silva was like that when he was the matchmaker also. So, yeah, Sean Shelby's been around forever. And then Nick Maynard, I think, is from the Houston area. He had been involved with some of the promotions there. So he's kind of like the younger of the two. But those are the guys that are doing most of the matchmaking. Yeah.
It makes sense. I mean, most of them, at the very least, even if it's not entertaining on the surface level, I feel like it always makes sense. Excuse me. You know, like it's, you could see, I'm trying to think of like a snooze fest fight that we knew would be a snooze fest, but it also kind of made sense. You know, there's like styles that make fun fights, but it's also like styles do kind of make fights, you know, and I feel like for the most part, even on the prelims, like Dana White will come out and say, oh yeah, this is a fight you need to watch. This is the reason you need to watch a fight because these two guys are going to be matched up pretty well. They do a good job of that.
Yeah. Sure.
But listen, I don't mean to make an Irish exit here, but I have to get editing on a video. I'd love to come on again, man. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, man, I'd love to have you back on. We'll think of something to do, and I appreciate you taking time to do this. It's great having you on, and great talking to you. Great meeting you.
Dude, thanks for lending me your platform. I really appreciate it.
All right, man. Take care.
All right. Have a good one.